Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into bridging work permits in Canada, especially for those of you kind of going through that, that transition from a temporary work permit to permanent residency. I know it can be exciting, but also a little confusing sometimes. So if you're in Canada hoping for PR,
Yeah.
and you see that expiry date on your work permit creeping up, well, this deep dive is for you.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to break down all those essential details about these permits, even those overlooked little things that can really make or break your application.
Yeah, I still remember when I first kind of came across these permits, it felt like I was trying to navigate through a maze. So let's start with the basics. What are bridging work permits and why are they so important?
Well, they're essentially a bridge. They let you work legally in Canada while your PR application is being processed. Without one, you'd be facing some tough choices, like maybe even having to leave Canada for a while, or switching to visitor status and putting your career on hold, or even trying to convince a new employer to go through that lengthy LMIA process. The labor market impact assessment. It's a lot.
Right, and we all know how challenging and time-consuming that can be. So bridging work permits really help prevent those major disruptions, in your life, in your career, while you're waiting for that PR decision. That peace of mind alone has got to be priceless. Now, I understand there are actually two types of bridging work permits. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Absolutely. So we have the Bridging Open Work Permit, or BOWP for short, and then we have the Bridging Closed Work Permit. They both serve that same basic purpose, but the flexibility they offer, that's where things get interesting.
Okay, so it's like a fork in the road. It sounds like the BOWP offers a bit more freedom.
You got it. Think of a BOWP like a VIP pass to the Canadian job market. You can work for almost any employer, any industry, anywhere in Canada. It's pretty great. It opens up a lot of possibilities, especially for folks who want to, you know, maybe explore new career paths or take advantage of better opportunities while they're waiting for their PR.
Wow, that's incredible. So if someone has a BOWP, they could switch companies, try a completely different field. It's all on the table.
Exactly. They could even relocate to a different province if the right opportunity comes up. It's all about maximizing your options during that waiting period.
That level of freedom must be a game changer for a lot of people. Okay, so then what about the bridging closed work permit? It sounds a bit more, well, restrictive.
It is. It is a bit more restrictive, but it serves a very specific purpose. It's typically for people who are nominated under a Provincial Nominee Program, PNP for short, and their nomination has conditions on their employment. It's kind of like a contract. The province nominated you based on a specific job offer, and the Bridging Closed Work Permit makes sure you keep that commitment while you're waiting for your PR.
I see. So let's say someone was nominated by a province to work as a chef in a specific restaurant. They would need a bridging closed work permit to continue working in that exact position.
Exactly. It ties them to that employer and that specific role. It ensures that the province's economic needs are being met and that the applicant is actually contributing to that specific area or industry, the one that supported their nomination in the first place.
Right, it makes sense. But all this talk about different permits and different requirements, it kind of raises the question of eligibility. How do you even know which permit you qualify for? Is there like a secret formula or something?
Aha, no secret formula. But understanding the eligibility criteria is super important. Applying for the wrong permit, that could lead to delays or even jeopardize your entire PR application.
Okay, no pressure then. So what are the key things we need to know about eligibility, especially for folks hoping to get a BOWP?
All right, well, first off, you got to be physically present in Canada with valid temporary resident status. That means having a valid work permit, maintaining your status and work authorization if you're waiting for a renewal, or being eligible to restore your status and get work permit.
So someone visiting Canada on a tourist visa wouldn't qualify.
No, not at all. You need to have been authorized to work in Canada at some point during your stay. And on top of that, you have to be the principal applicant on a PR application that's currently in process. And it has to have reached a specific stage, like you need to have passed the completeness check or received a positive eligibility assessment.
Got it. So being in Canada with work authorization, being the main PR applicant, and having a PR application that's moving along, okay, that makes sense. But what about those PNP nominees? Anything specific they should be aware of?
Ah, yes, the PNP caveat. This is where things get a little tricky. If you got a PNP nomination, there's one phrase in your nomination letter that's super important. Restrictions on employment.
Restrictions on employment. Sounds ominous. What's the big deal with that phrase?
It's like a decoder ring for your bridging work permit options. If your nomination letter says yes to restrictions on your employment, then a bridging closed work permit is your only path. But If it says no to restrictions, well, then you might be eligible for that BOWP, with all that flexibility we talked about.
Wow, that one little yes or no can make a huge difference. So why are these employment restrictions so important for PNP nominees?
It all comes down to making sure the PNP program is doing what it's supposed to do. Provinces use those restrictions to guarantee that the people they nominate
Hmm.
are actually contributing to their specific economic needs. For example, let's say a province nominates a doctor to help with a shortage in a rural area. They might put restrictions on their employment just to make sure that doctor stays in that community, providing those much-needed medical services.
Makes sense. So those restrictions are there to make sure the PNP program benefits everyone involved, both the nominee and the province. Now, what about those who DO have those restrictions? The ones who need a bridge and closed work permit? Any additional hoops they got to jump through?
Yeah, there are a few more steps. The employer needs to get involved. They need to register the job offer in the employer portal and get a unique identifier called an A number. Plus, you'll need a letter of support from the province, basically confirming that the job offer is legit and urgent.
Okay, so it's not just about having those restrictions on the PNP nomination. There's some extra legwork involved for that closed permit. Now, before we dive deeper into each specific permit, let's talk about spouses and families for a minute. Can they work while the main applicant is on a bridging work permit?
That's a great question, and it's one that causes a lot of confusion. Spouses of BOWP holders might be eligible for a spousal open work permit. We call it a SOWP for short, but it's not automatic.
So there are conditions for spouses too.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a bunch of factors at play.
Yeah.
And things have gotten even more complex recently with changes to the SOWP program. We'll actually dedicate a whole segment to spousal work permits later on. But for now, just know that eligibility isn't guaranteed.
Good to know. So we've established that getting the right bridging work permit, it's essential for maintaining your status in Canada and continuing your career path while you're waiting for that PR decision. But what happens if you get a job offer while you're on a bridging work permit? Can you just switch employers?
That's where things can get a little tricky, especially for those on a bridging closed work permit. Changing employers without proper authorization can have some pretty serious consequences. You could even put your whole PR application at risk.
Whoa, seriously. So it's not as simple as just accepting a new job offer.
Nope, not at all. For those with a closed permit, remember their nomination is tied to that specific employer. If they switch employers, they risk violating the conditions of their PNP nomination and their work permit.
That's a big risk. Definitely something to be cautious about. So the takeaway here is anyone thinking about changing employers while on a bridging work permit should really talk to an expert first, just to make sure they understand the potential implications.
Exactly. It's all about making informed decisions, ones that align with your long-term immigration goals.
This has been so insightful. We've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the purpose of bridging work permits, the two main types, the open and the closed permits, and even touched on the initial eligibility criteria. Now in our next segment, we're going to take a closer look at BOWPs and explore the eligibility nuances for both PNP and express entry candidates. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our conversation about bridging work permits in Canada. It's a topic I know is on a lot of your minds, especially if you're hoping to secure your future here in Canada. Last time we talked about the two main types of bridging work permits, the open and the closed permits. So now let's zoom in on that bridging open work permit, the BOWP, and really unpack those eligibility criteria.
Sounds good. We touched on some of those general requirements for BOWPs already. Being in Canada, having work authorization, having a PR application that's currently in progress. But there are some nuances depending on which immigration program you're using to apply for PR.
Right. It's not just PNP nominees who might be eligible for a BOWP. Express entry candidates could be in the running too.
Exactly. For those who might not know, Express Entry is Canada's main online system for managing applications for skilled workers. It includes programs like the Federal Skilled Worker Program, the Canadian Experience Class, and the Federal Skilled Trades Program. It's all points-based. And the competition can be pretty fierce, so having a BOWP while you wait for your Express Entry application to be processed, well, that can be a huge advantage.
Yeah, it must be a relief knowing you can continue working without being tied to one specific employer. So for those applying for PR through Express Entry, what are the key things they should know about BOWP eligibility?
The good news is, Express Entry candidates usually don't have to worry about those employment restrictions, the ones we talked about earlier, but they're still going to meet those core requirements.
Oh, you mean like being in Canada, having work authorization, and having a PR application in progress?
Exactly, that trifecta. And remember, This goes for both PNP and express entry candidates. You can only apply for a BOWP from inside Canada. You can't apply at a port of entry when you're crossing the border or anything like that.
Right, so no flag polling for this one. And just so everyone knows, flag polling is when someone leaves Canada briefly, like driving to the U.S. border and back, and then they try to apply for a new status or permit when they re-enter. It works for some permits, but not for BOWPs.
Nope. BOWP applications have to be submitted electronically from within Canada. Speaking of applying, there's something important to keep in mind about timing. What happens if your current work permit expires while you're waiting for a decision on your BOWP application?
Ooh, that's a good question. A lot of people are probably wondering about that. Are you just stuck in limbo, unable to work?
Not necessarily. There's something called maintain status that kicks in here. If you submitted your BOWP application before your existing work permit expired, you're generally allowed to keep working while you wait for that decision.
Phew, that's a relief. But I imagine it gets a little more complicated if you're also trying to renew a work permit that's tied to a specific employer.
Yeah, you're right. It can get tricky. If you're renewing a work permit that's linked to a specific employer, and that same employer is supporting your PR application, things are usually pretty straightforward. Your status and work authorization should continue while you wait for both decisions, the work permit renewal and the BOWP.
So it's all about alignment. The employer, the current work permit, and the PR application are all connected. Makes sense that your status would be maintained in that situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But if you're switching employers,
Right.
or if your current employer isn't involved in your PR process, well, then things can get a lot more complex. You absolutely have to make sure you maintain your legal status and work authorization throughout that entire BOWP application process. Honestly, in those situations, it's always best to talk to an immigration professional.
Yeah, I'm starting to see why having an expert on your side is so valuable. It's easy to get lost in all the details. Speaking of details, I bet some of our listeners are ready to apply for their BOWP right now. Are there any common mistakes people make that we should warn them about?
Oh yeah, for sure. And these mistakes can be costly. They can delay your PR journey, or even worse, completely derail it.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell us what not to do.
Well, one of the most common mistakes is people forget to check that PNP nomination letter for employment restrictions. Remember that yes or no, we talked about. If your PNP nomination has employment restrictions, you can't get a BOWP. You got to apply for a bridging closed work permit instead.
Right, and we talked about those extra steps involved with the closed permit, like the employer registering the job offer, the letter of support from the province, all that stuff.
Exactly. Another mistake we see a lot is people think that just because they're eligible to work in Canada under some other LMIA exemption, like maybe they're a postgraduate work permit holder, they automatically qualify for a BOWP. That's not true at all. BOWPs are specifically for people who have already applied for PR and are waiting for a decision.
That's a good point. Don't assume anything. Check those eligibility requirements carefully. What other traps should people watch out for?
Sometimes people get a little too eager, and they try to flagpole their BOWP application at the port of entry. We talked about this earlier. BOWP applications have to be submitted electronically from inside Canada.
Right, no shortcuts. I'm guessing submitting an incomplete application is a big no-no, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. IRCC, that's Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, they're very strict about that. You got to follow that document checklist carefully. Make sure you include every single document they asked for. Missing even one document can lead to processing delays, or even a refusal.
Okay, I'm sensing a theme here. Attention to detail is critical. Now, what if someone accidentally gives incorrect information on their application? Is that a big deal?
It can be a very serious issue. Misrepresentation, even if it was unintentional, can have major consequences. You could even be found inadmissible to Canada.
Whoa. Inadmissible?
Yeah. That means you could be banned from entering the country, maybe for a certain period of time, or even permanently.
Wow. Honesty really is the best policy when it comes to immigration applications. No point in taking any chances.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, even small details matter. For example, if your BOWP application says you're going to live in one province, but your PNP nomination restricts you to a different province, that could be considered misrepresentation.
So double check everything. Triple check everything. Any other words of wisdom before I move on?
Yeah. Don't let your previous work permit expire without doing something about it if your work permit's expiring soon, and you haven't submitted a renewal application or a BOWP application, you could lose your status and your ability to work legally in Canada.
Noted. Stay on top of those deadlines, everyone. Okay, so we've talked about eligibility and common mistakes. But what happens if, despite all your best efforts, your BOWP application is refused. What are your options then?
That's a really important question, and unfortunately, it does happen to some people. If your BOWP application is refused, it's really important to understand why.
So don't panic and give up. There might be a way to fix it.
Exactly. Sometimes it's a simple mistake, like a missing document or an error on the application form. In those cases, you can just reapply with the correct information.
Like a second chance. But what if the refusal is because of something more serious, like you don't actually meet the eligibility criteria?
Then things get a little trickier. You might have to look at other work permit options, like maybe an LMIA-based work permit, if you can find an employer willing to go through that process.
Which I'm guessing isn't always easy.
Not always. It could be pretty tough, especially in certain industries or regions where there might be labor shortages or specific requirements for hiring foreign workers.
Okay, so getting a BOWP refusal isn't necessarily the end of the world, but it definitely makes things more complicated.
It does, and that's why it's so important to try to get it right the first time. Plan carefully, pay attention to detail, and don't be afraid to ask for professional help if you need it.
Great advice. Now, before we wrap up this segment, I have one more question. What if someone changes employers while their BOWP application is being processed? Is that a bad idea?
It could be, especially if it means moving to a different province or taking a job that's completely different from what your original PR application was based on. Remember, IRCC wants to see consistency, a clear path towards permanent residency.
So changing employers while you're waiting for a BOWP decision, that's not something to take lightly.
Definitely not. If you're thinking about changing jobs during that time, talk to an immigration professional first. They can help you understand how it might affect your BOWP and PR applications.
It's all about managing expectations and really understanding the implications of your choices. Well, we've covered a lot about BOWP eligibility today. We talked about common mistakes and even what to do if your application is refused. In our next segment, we'll switch gears and focus on bridging closed work permits, those permits with the specific employer restrictions. And we'll dive into all the unique things you need to know about those. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've spent quite a bit of time exploring bridging open work permits, those flexible permits that give you so many options while you're waiting for your PR. But now let's shift our focus to their more, shall we say, structured counterpart, the bridging closed work permit.
Right. These are typically for folks whose PNP nomination has those specific conditions on their employment, like we talked about earlier.
Exactly. We discussed the restrictions on employment clause in the PNP nomination letter. If it says yes, a bridging closed work permit is most likely the route you'll need to take.
And while it might seem a bit limiting at first glance, I imagine there are some strategic advantages to having this type of permit too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think of it this way. A bridging closed work permit guarantees that you can keep working in that same job, so you can build a strong relationship with your employer while you wait for your PR to come through. That could be a real asset if you're looking to grow your career with that company or even within that particular industry.
Yeah, it's like setting the stage for your long-term career goals in Canada, even before you have permanent residency.
Smart. Now, we talked before about how changing employers while you're on a bridging work permit can be risky, especially if you have a closed permit. Can you break down why that is?
Sure. Changing employers when you have a bridging closed work permit can actually have some serious consequences. Remember, your PNP nomination is based on that specific job offer you received. If you switch employers, it could look like you're not keeping your end of the agreement outlined in your nomination, and that could even lead to your nomination being revoked. Yikes. Not a risk worth taking. And I imagine it could also mess with the processing time of your PR application, too.
Yeah, absolutely. IRCC wants to see a clear path towards permanent residency, a consistent plan. If you change employers out of the blue, it raises questions about whether you're still committed to the terms of your PNP nomination, and that could lead to delays in your PR application.
So it's all about staying the course and showing that you're serious about fulfilling that commitment you made to the province that nominated you. It's about proving that you're here to contribute to their workforce.
Exactly. Building that trust and showing that you're here to stay for the long run.
Now let's bring spousal work permits back into the conversation for a moment. We mentioned earlier that spouses of BOWP holders might be eligible for a spousal open work permit, or SOWP. But we also said it's not always a sure thing.
Right. It's definitely not a guarantee. There are a lot of details and conditions that come into play. SOWP eligibility has gotten a bit more complicated in recent years, especially with some of the recent changes to the program. There are a lot of factors to consider now, like how genuine the relationship is, whether the principal applicant's work permit is still valid, even the type of work the principal applicant is doing.
It sounds like a potential minefield. So for our listeners whose spouses are hoping to work in Canada, talking to a professional is probably the best way to go, right?
100%.
Uh-huh.
An immigration expert can guide them through the ins and outs of the SOWP application process, help them understand the specific requirements, and make sure everything is done correctly.
Absolutely. Always better to be safe than sorry when it comes to this stuff. Now, before we wrap up, let's tackle one more important question. What happens if your bridging work permit application is refused? What are your options?
That's a tough situation to be in, for sure. It can be disheartening to have your application refused after all the work you put into it. But the first thing to do is take a deep breath and really read through that refusal letter. IRCC will outline the reasons why your application was refused, and understanding those reasons is key.
So it's not just a random rejection. They have to tell you why they said no.
Right. They have to explain what went wrong, and that's important because it will help you figure out your next steps. Sometimes it's an easy fix, like you forgot to include a document or there was an error on your application form.
Ah, so it might be something simple that you can correct and then just reapply.
Yep, exactly. Other times, though, the refusal is because you didn't meet the eligibility requirements, and that can be a bit more complicated.
Right, and in those cases, it might be time to consult with an immigration professional to explore different options or maybe even develop a new strategy.
You got it. They can help you figure out if there are other work permit categories you might qualify for, or if there's anything you can do to address the issues that led to the refusal in the first place.
So it's not always a dead end, even if your application is refused, but it definitely highlights the importance of getting things right from the start.
I agree. Careful planning, paying close attention to detail, and knowing when to reach out for professional guidance, those are all crucial when navigating this process.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a ton of ground today about bridging work permits in Canada. We explored both open and closed permits, touched on spousal work permits, and even discussed what to do if your application is refused. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with?
I'd say the biggest thing is understanding that bridging work permits are a valuable tool for anyone who wants to make the transition from temporary resident to permanent resident in Canada. They let you keep working, build your career, and contribute to the Canadian economy while you're waiting for that PR decision.
And they come in different forms, each with their own sets of rules and requirements.
Right. It's super important to choose the right permit, meet all the eligibility criteria, and be aware of those potential pitfalls we talked about. And remember, you don't have to go through this alone. Don't hesitate to reach out to an immigration consultant or lawyer.
They can help you navigate the process, make sure your application is accurate and complete, and answer any questions you have along the way. It's a smart investment that can save you a lot of headaches in the long run.
Couldn't agree more. And for those of you listening who are feeling a bit overwhelmed, remember, take it one step at a time. Gather the information you need, talk to an expert if you have to, and stay focused on those immigration goals.
Canada is always looking for skilled people from all over the world, and bridging work permits are a way to show that commitment to newcomers. They offer you a pathway to contribute your talents and build your future in Canada. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. See you next time on The Deep Dive.